Maggie Crowley is a senior director of product management at Drift and the host of their podcast, Build with Maggie Crowley. After a few years of consulting, Maggie attended Harvard Business School, where she received her MBA and learned about the great world of product management. Since then, she's worked her way up the product career ladder at Boston-based companies like TripAdvisor and Drift.
I remember there was one a couple years ago, where she was, one of the PMs was snowboarding, I think, and did a product pitch while she was snowboarding to
Wow.
I can't remember what the product was, but I remember we were all like, yo, Alexa, that's crazy.
That's funny you mentioned while snowboarding. One of the people on our sales team, she broke bones in her leg snowboarding 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
And we didn't even get any promo out of it.
Yep.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome to Without a Roadmap. It's the podcast for product folks who get the job done but are still figuring it out. My name is Jonas, joined here by my co-host Cam and a very special guest, Maggie Crowley. Great to have you on the show, Maggie.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm super excited to be here.
Yeah, we're super excited to have you as well. Another Boston-based startup company linking up and then joining together to do a podcast.
Love it.
So we have a bunch of stuff we want to cover with Maggie today, primarily going over her path into products, some of the more business strategy aspects of product management that don't get talked about as much in maybe our opinion, and then some other stuff about startup attitude and things like that. But to start, I think we want to go over Maggie's journey into product and how she ended up at Drift, one of the more successful startups around.
Yeah, so I don't know anymore how typical the path I have is. I kind of feel like it's the easy path or the standard path these days. But back when I got into product, I didn't even know it was a job. So it wasn't something that I was kind of out to get. But I was at business school and I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And I figured the internet was the place, and
Right.
Google was the place where the internet was. And I'm not being facetious. That was as sophisticated as my logic was. And I was like, let me go to San Francisco and Hail Mary myself into Google and see what happens. So I spent a summer out there working in ad partnerships, which wasn't a fit for me. But my roommate was a PM, and he would come home from work and he would be talking about all the problems they were tackling and the strategy and where Google was going. And it was all this really interesting stuff. And I'm just sitting there what job is this? This sounds way cooler than what I'm doing. And he was a product manager. So that's when I figured out that it was a role. And I think from there, my path was, I was lucky enough to be going into my second year of business school, could recruit at big companies who hire for PMs who don't necessarily have PM experience or an engineering background, which was a thing back then. And TripAdvisor had a rotation program for new PMs. And I kind of tried, maybe this is a whole different podcast, but I over-prepared so aggressively for that interview because I really wanted the job. Got the job, and that was sort of what launched me into PM in the first place.
How did you more so learn product management on the job when you joined TripAdvisor? Because I have a similar kind of path in the product where I didn't really know what it was until I actually started my first job out of college. So I applied through the normal college job boards, and then a role stuck out. It was called, I think, a product specialist.
Mm-hmm.
And the description was very bare bones, follow standard procedure outlined by your manager. And then week before my start date, I just emailed them hey, should I be reading anything, or what do I do to prepare? And then they were yeah, just read something about product management. I was oh. So I just went to my Googles, and then I saw what the first 4 articles was. My first day, I was hey, what do I do?
That's amazing. Yeah, I think I don't know how funny the story is, but I always laugh about it. There was a class in business school that was called PM 101. And it was, I think, the second year it had ever been available was the year that I could have taken it. And for whatever reason, I just don't remember even seeing it in the course catalog. So I just didn't even know that it was a class that one could take. And then I come back from my summer and I'm oh man, I want to be a PM. And all my business school friends were oh, were you in PM 101? And I'm what? PM 101?
Oh, no.
What are you guys talking about? So no, I didn't get any formal education in product. But I also think that having done it for many years now, that I think that class would have been helpful, but I think it's an apprenticeship role. Like you learn how to do it on the job. It's really hard. I can't imagine learning how to do product without doing product, because so much of it is contextual. It's all about how you interact with the different groups, how you think about data, how you synthesize different data sources and figure out what you want to do and what the path forward is. And I struggle to think about how I would have done that, learned as fast as I did just doing it as part of a company and kind of on the job. So.
Mm-hmm. So you started at TripAdvisor. Can you talk us through when you went to Drift, how the two were different? Because Jonas and I, obviously, Parlor selling to like product teams, and talking through them, they're all ran differently. They all operate differently, have different tools, whatever it is may be. So maybe talk to us a little bit about how they differed, and if you had to kind of relearn some things when going to Drift to kind of fit how they ran product.
Yeah. I think the most obvious difference is, B2B versus B2C. So TripAdvisor is a huge B2C company. Drift at the time was 80 people, primarily B2B. And I did a stopover at another B2B or sort of restaurant tech startup in between. And I think the difference, or the way I think about the difference, is really each place I've been is adding like tools into my toolkit. So it's not that I think that any one company necessarily has it figured out, but it's more, let me learn a different way to do this, that then when I'm in another situation in a new place, I'm going to have something that I can fall back on, that I know about how to apply it to a given situation. So in TripAdvisor, it was really, how does a big product org work at scale? How do we think about what we're working on? How do we communicate that? How do we think about experiments? How do we do customer research at scale and all that kind of stuff? Whereas at Drift, the first thing I learned that I hadn't gotten at TripAdvisor as much was, how do you do like one-to-one customer research, and like what does it look like to do deep generative user research with a customer? Like just learning from them, what do you care about? What are you doing in your day-to-day? Like what are you goaled on? What are your goals for this quarter? Having those types of conversations were things I wasn't doing at TripAdvisor. And another part of that is that the Drift user wasn't me in the way that I was a user of TripAdvisor. So that was another motion that I didn't know as well, was how do you build for something that you have almost no context in? Like I didn't know this space at all when I joined Drift. People were, saying terms and words and acronyms, and I'm like Googling them at my desk, like on my day one, like, I don't know what a CRM is, like, let me Google that. So yeah, I think it was all, those were the big differences. I don't actually see like a ton of difference, as long as the product role that you're in isn't just managing a backlog. I think there's like a flavor of company where you're backlog managing, and then there's a flavor of company where you are proactively figuring out what the business needs. And as you can tell by my heavily biased statement, I much prefer to be in the latter category, but I don't have a ton of experience in the backlog management type of product.
Yeah, no, one thing that we've noticed in conversations with people at the different stages is that, there's kind of two different types generally of product managers. There's the kind of managers of people and the managers of work. And, clearly based on the trajectory you've been on, you kind of, fall kind of more closely towards the strategy and people management side. And I'm curious, is there something about your kind of background in consulting and in your, MBA that's kind of pushed you towards thinking more strategically, or is that kind of just what you feel like suits you based on your kind of skill sets?
It's a good question. I think that the tactical skills that I got in consulting were probably the most applicable to being a direct PM, because the consulting role is all about, trying to, you have some sort of client problem that you're brought in to solve, and you need to get up to speed really quickly on like, what's the problem, what's the context, what's the situation, all the market forces and all that kind of stuff. And then you come up with a recommendation. This is obviously like grossly oversimplified, but that's effectively what you're doing. And I think the PM job is pretty similar in that you're like, okay, I have a customer problem that I need to figure out, and I need to make a recommendation about how we should solve it. So I think a lot of that motion is the same, but the difference is, the mechanics of it and, workflows and learning that type of stuff. So I think consulting probably prepared me for the synthesizing of information and, how to work with lots of different stakeholders and lots of different stakeholder types and managing tricky relationships and that kind of stuff. The MBA, I don't think was as directly useful for the early days of product. It's more useful now that my job is much more where are we going and where do we have to go to meet the business requirements that we have. So that's what's been useful to me. And I think the reason why I lean towards the strategy and business side is mostly just because I really like to be in the mix of what are we doing as a business and why? And like, is that the right thing? And are we going to drive value for customers? I think those questions are really interesting and I like to be a part of them. And so that's why I've kind of leaned the way I've leaned, because this is the role where I get to do that the most, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes perfect
Yep.
sense. I think there's a interesting kind of relationship here. Like you both mentioned being either the strategy side or like for you, the managing of like business needs, and then also like the management of like the backlog, which is we all as product people know is like the stories, the things that get worked on by engineers, developers. I kind of want to hear both of your opinions on how those two work together and how you separate the two, right? Because obviously you know what the business needs, or you think you know what the business needs, or the direction you need to go in. And then the other side is the people that are in charge of making sure that the company gets to that direction, right? So how do you make sure everyone's aligned on like where the business is going, and like the age-old question, how do you prioritize based on that?
I mean, no one's figured this out. If they did, they would have made billions of dollars selling to all of us, whatever their solution is.
Right.
Or maybe you guys are solving it. I don't know. I think the way I think about it is that, yes, I don't want to be sitting there like just managing a backlog, but I think that's shorthand for like, I don't think just listing out features and then shipping them one at a time is going to be the right strategy for like getting whatever it is done that needs to get done. Instead, I think about it more like my job is to understand what's happening in the market with our customers, with our business, with adjacent markets, with trends, all that kind of stuff. What's our strategy and what does the product have to be to get us there? Like, how do I think about that? And that means what bets do we have to take? What are the sure things? What are the fixes we need to do? Like there's a whole portfolio, right, of different types of things that you want to work on.
Right.
And then part of my job is also bringing in the people who need to agree with that or like get on board, right? So part of that is, me sharing some wet paint ideas with an engineering leader to say, okay, like this is kind of what I think we should do. Yes, no, good, bad, what do you think? Like working with the design leader saying, okay, like this is the same type of conversation, and just making sure I'm involving all those people as they need to be involved so that there's no surprises, everyone has a chance to think about it, and we all can agree on where we want to go. So I don't think that there's any clear separation between those different things, because everyone kind of has to have a chance to have a voice, but my job at the end of the day is driving us towards making choices and having clarity.
I would agree that that's kind of where I fall in the PM kind of landscape, is like I feel like really excited about kind of thinking about kind of longer term vision, kind of like where the product needs to fit. And, I think there's an interesting, to be in that space, because, there's a lot of times where you're focused on what the business needs to do and where it needs to go in order to, make the most money. At the end of the day, everything is kind of coming back to that, unless you're some, overvalued startup that's, just getting money poured in. But at the end of the day, revenue is important. And so I'm curious your thoughts on how you really balance the, importance of kind of thinking strategically and in line with the business, but, also balancing the needs of the customers that you have today. And, especially when in some cases they might not, those two might not align completely.
Yeah, it's a good question. Although I don't know if I totally agree that they're always separate. I think they would be separate if you are making a strategic choice to abandon a customer segment or abandon a market. I think I actually, the longer that I'm in product, the more that I think that sometimes the strategy is the easy thing, because you get to think about, what's this like beautiful vision I have for the future, and like, it would be amazing if our product did this and this, and like how awesome would it be if we were tackled this opportunity.
Right.
But it's like
the dreamland.
Exactly. We can all like put that down on paper, right? I think I actually, speaking about podcasting and product, I recorded a podcast last week about this.
Like, I know I cheated.
I listened. The hard part is like, how do you plan? How do you get from here to there? So I think that's, Jonas, that's kind of your question, right? It's like, okay, well, here's the strategy. Here's where we are. How do I plan from A to B? And how do I do that in a way that's like additive to the business and doesn't like is possible. And so to me, that's the really hard part, is like the execution on the strategy and the plan, and how you have to take into account the reality. And the reality is your product, it's your customer input, but it's also emotions, right? It's the emotions of the team. It's what they want to do, what they don't want to do. You know, it's the things that have gone wrong, the things that have gone well. And you have to kind of factor all that in how you plan, which is something that I didn't expect when I started. I didn't think that there would be so much nuance to like that process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100% agree with that. Because when you're doing some of these like kickoffs or like overview meetings to like tackle the next business objective, and you're bringing up like, oh, we need to do X, Y, Z to do ABC or whatever it may be. People like sometimes have like these scarred memories of like how stressful doing all that was to meet either a certain deadline you set for like VC funding, or a deadline set by like a really big customer, and they just like immediately start getting stressed. And so I think it is important to go over like some of the process things, even though it's not the most fun thing to talk about. But I've been learning over time that having a solid foundation of like a process, whether that's either as agile or there's no type of methodology you're following, you kind of just going with the flow. You need to have something that everyone is aligned on of how to do things, just to keep everybody's sanity in check, so that people aren't burning out, freaking out, having panic attacks, that we just sign up for all of these items to be built within 2 months and there's only like 4 engineers to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's interesting. I mean, you're both working at a startup. So one of the things that I have learned over time is that my tolerance for change is maybe not the same as someone else's. So if you
Exactly.
thrive in an early stage startup, then someone, you know, maybe your startup grows up and it's bigger and something changes. You're like, great, it's changing. Like, cool. This is how it always is. But someone who doesn't have that experience might be like totally freaked out by it. And that was a lesson I had to learn, which is my understanding of what is a lot of change is not the same, having been through that experience. And so how do I remember that and think about that when we're planning? Because I can't just be like, we'll change everything.
Yeah.
So.
I think I'm the same way. Like I embrace change, and I actually enjoy it because it's fun, exciting, new challenge to conquer. But that's not the same mindset that everybody else has. And so,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and shout out to Terry Harwood, one of our guests from a few weeks ago, who was telling us all about the different types of PMs and how you could be a really great startup PM, but you just would never fit in at, you know, some sort of large healthcare, you know, software group. And, you know, it's just there's so many nuances, and that needs to be taken into account. And I think that's something that I've learned a lot from recently, is that, you know, I don't think I would fit in a lot of places just based on some of those tendencies.
I was that large healthcare PM that left to go to a startup.
Look at you now. You look relatively happy now.
I am happy.
Yeah, look at, he's got a denim hat on, you know, like you couldn't do that before. Yeah.
So we talked about a lot about the strategy and stuff like that. I think one point I know we wanted to talk through is when you're in the early days of like being the product manager, whether that's the various different titles, associate PM, product owner, whatever it may be at your company, you're more so just taking direction from your manager or like the director or whoever is above you to kind of groom the backlog, make sure things are getting worked on the right time and being delivered. In your opinion, what has worked for you, or what have you seen work for people to take that next step to kind of start thinking about more of the strategic goals of the product organization?
Couple of things. One, I've had this conversation many times with PMs who are earlier in their career, and they ask a very similar question, which is, I want to work on strategy. How do I get to work on strategy? And what I think is interesting is that the thing that gets you promoted most generally, or gets you access to that most generally in companies, is your autonomy, your impact, and your scope. So how autonomous are you in like understanding a problem, figuring it out, and driving to a decision? How much scope can you handle? So what size of a problem can you handle on your own? And then impact, right? So what business outcomes are you driving through your work? At the end of the day, as a PM, and this only gets more true as the higher you go, you are judged on the impact that you can drive for your business, not on how well you wrote a spec or how well you ran a sprint, or, you know, how many points you got on the board, or whatever thing it is that you do. Like, you're judged on impact. So my response when someone asks me that question is always, you know what the cadence is for strategy. If you do quarterly goals, you know that a month or two before the quarter starts, someone somewhere is thinking about the strategy, right? Someone is thinking about that. And
That's
if you don't like fill the gap, someone fills it for you. So if you're an associate PM, you're told pretty much like what the thing is that you're going to work on because you're new. That's totally fine.
Yep.
But I would say like the more senior you are, don't let someone tell you, like be proactive. You know when that cadence is coming and answer the question. Like, you know what the strategic questions are. You could Google them. We can talk about them right now. And I always say, like, just you tell me then. You tell me what you think the strategy is. You tell me what you think you need to do with your product. And that shows me that, or whoever's in my position, that you're ready for that next thing because you're thinking about your product more broadly. You're thinking about it in the context of the business and you're like answering that question. So it's really a mindset shift. It's not how do you get the skills? It's more like, how do you start to see yourself not as a consumer of a strategy, but as like the creator of it? And how do you start to broaden yourself out and start to be proactive about that? Is a signal that A, you're ready for the promotion or the next step, but also B is how you show that you might be ready for it.
Mm-hmm. How about we do go into some of those different questions that maybe you think through that help you or have helped you in the past?
Yeah, I mean, I just did this the other day. It's a core part of my job. I haven't nailed I don't think I have a beautiful format, or else I would share like a template, which I'm deeply upset about. Like I need my 2x2 and my doc or whatever.
Right.
But
I'm ready for it.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. I'll let you know. I'll publish it. But the what I did this time around was I sort of said, scrap all that. Let me just figure out like what do I need to know in order to figure out where we need to go? And the general questions I would ask are like, what's the current state of your product? So what's working, what's not working? What are your core metrics? What are the top customer themes? Where are your escalations coming from? What's the tech debt that you're working with? If you were to scale if your product were to grow by 25% in the next 2 quarters, what are the big technical things that you'd have to tackle for it not to fall over? So that's like state of the world. Then I would look at your market. So what's happening with your competitors? What markets are they moving into? What are they talking about? What adjacent companies to you might move into your space, and how do you know? And what are the I don't know a better word than what's the vibe happening with all of them?
Yep.
Yeah, I haven't figured out the official.
I love that word.
Harvard Business School strategic assessment of this. So I would do that, and then I would also look at, I think, again, I work in B2B. So I also think about, what are the consumer trends in consumer that might come over to B2B that might be interesting. So I do kind of look at that. And then I think about, what's our business's plan? Like what's our big strategic goal that we're working on, our 5-year plan or whatever it is that you have? What does that mean for the part of the product I work on where I think we have to be? And then I also don't have a good way to articulate this part. Those are all the inputs. And then you just kind of let it sit in your brain, and then you just make some bets on what you think you have to do. And the constraint you can use is, we want to invest 20% in crazy ideas. We want to invest some percentage in the core. We want to invest some time in fixes and technical debt. And then you just kind of figure it out. And then you iterate from there.
I like that a lot because I've been trying to kind of think of a terminology or some vocabulary to kind of encompass what the last part you just talked about. You making big bets, and then the way I was thinking of it, you have big bets. You have the core things that you just mentioned. You have quick wins that are small mini things that add value to the product that may or may not push you towards those goals, but it's something that can add value to the product for somebody that is going to use it. And so I just been trying to think through how to kind of structure priorities for that. Fun fact, the Parler CEO, Keith Frankel, hates the term roadmap stuff. So we have to use product priorities for everything.
Yeah. I mean, I've been on all sides of the roadmap conversation, so I don't have a strong opinion about it today. But everything that we're talking about is a tool, right? They're all tools that we can use to figure out what we want to do. And I think there's one thing I learned from the podcast is that there's definitely not a right way, and that every method has pros and cons, but it's more about, do you know what method to use at a given point in time to get you to move forward? That's what I think about is, okay, which of the 10 ways of road mapping is going to help me right now? Which of the 18 strategic questions I just listed is most important for me to understand today, right? So it's not really about which one is right. It's more about which one is a fit for your problem.
One more topic that on this point that I thought was really interesting is you mentioned technical debt or like technical limitations that you may have to overcome within the next couple of months to reach those goals. I really haven't heard a lot of product people talk about that side of things. So curious how you plan or how you approach those conversations with your engineering department.
I asked them exactly the question I said. So the conversation we had, I think a big mistake or trap people fall into is treating their engineering and their design team as just inputs or consumers of this process, right? So the first place I go when I'm doing this work is my design and engineering counterparts, because they know the business just like I do. They know the customers, they know the product. I mean, the design engineers know the product better than I do at this point.
Right.
So they're like, I don't think you can do this without them. And that's a question that I think is specifically helpful, because sometimes it's really hard for an engineer to like articulate in the level of detail that you need. Because I don't necessarily need to know I would like to know, but I don't have to know like what is the problem we need to solve. But what I need to be able to do is give a constraint to them so they can answer the question. Because there's endless tech debt. There's endless things we could do to scale or whatever platform we're working on. And so a more useful question is, and I learned this from an engineering director, Bernard, who I work with, who's amazing. And he said, well, can you go tell me what our forecasted customer growth is for the next 2 quarters? And can then you look at the customers that we have and model out how much more use of this platform you think we're going to get? And I will tell you what we need to do to serve that. And that's what we did. And so I was like, okay, great. Here's the information. Here's what we think we're going to see. And he said, amazing. This service is going to fall over when we hit this many customers. So we're going to fix that first. And he was like, it's going to take us this many weeks and this many people, and then we'll do it and we'll be good until this point. But we're going to ask this question every quarter, so we always know to check in on whether we're going to run into this problem. So that's one example of how to do it.
So the idea is to basically provide them with all the information they need to just do the simple thing that they're really good at that most people aren't.
Yeah, and part of it's also respecting that it's not an afterthought, right? Like the quality of your platform or of your products can't be like a secondary to like the value you're creating for customers. So, and I think it does your product a disservice over time if you forget to do that work. And then it also makes it hard. Like your engineers will be unhappy if you never fix some of this stuff. In the same way that design is going to be unhappy if your product like looks like crap and you don't build it to the specifications that they create. So it's just part of like the health of the company and health of your product to do. And it also makes your life easier. And engineers love it when you ask them that question.
Yeah. I wanted to slightly shift gears. I think a lot of what you were kind of talking about in terms of, trying to establish some sort of career growth, and, it's really like kind of pulling yourself up and deciding whether or not you're going to kind of, contribute or just kind of consume from product strategy. So it really just got me thinking about the idea of the startup attitude, because that's something that I kind of feel like is essential to work in a smaller company. It's really like you're expected to do that. So I'm curious what that looks like since you've worked in both larger companies like TripAdvisor and smaller companies like Drift, which are still considered a startup. What about the kind of product operations? What the differences that you've seen, and kind of what are some of the different things that either industry might be able to learn from one another? Because I know in particular that the big thing now is larger enterprise companies are saying that they have a startup mindset or startup attitude, but it's like, you did something right to get as large as you are today. So I'm curious from your perspective what that means.
Yeah, I mean, of course, I have a healthy skepticism about huge companies saying they have a startup attitude, mostly because I think when people, at least when I hear startup attitude, one of the things it brings up for me is that at a startup, there's no one is going to do the thing, right? So if you have an idea, let's say you're talking about product ops, maybe you have a question about data. If I have a question about data, the only person that's going to answer it is me. And that's like the mentality I think that goes away in some respect at a bigger company, which is you don't always have the owner. It's harder to have ownership, I think, because you can't do all the stuff yourself. Like if you have a business question, maybe there's an analyst that you can go and ask, or, maybe someone else has already done an analysis, or, you go over here and there's a person who owns that part of the product. But at a startup, sometimes you're the first person asking that question. And then I always kind of feel like it's one of those situations where, well, you brought it up, so like now you got to go do it. So I think that's a thing I think about with startup is people who have that ownership and say, okay, well, yeah, we got to go get this done. So like, I guess I'm going to go figure out how to make it happen. And it doesn't scale, right? Like it's not efficient for you to be doing everything all the time. And so that's why, there's more nuance at a bigger company. But yeah, I think that the thing I would say that I want to keep with me no matter what size of company I'm at is that attitude of, well, I'll figure it out. Like maybe I'll figure it out and I'm an owner and I want to drive something to completion and not just say, well, like, no one's done this. So oh, well, I think that's the type of thing that creeps in a big company.
Yeah, no, I completely hear that. And I think that's, one of, it is good to have that startup attitude. I think it pushes everybody to be really scrappy, but sometimes like that scrappiness isn't the most effective or efficient use of time. So
yeah.
I think it's like a balance of the two. And, I guess.
Yeah, that's something that's definitely been the case as Drift has scaled is learning, recognizing when the inflection point, where the inflection point is between the scrappy version is good enough and when it needs to be better. So you can think about this in terms of the product itself, or your analytics or your processes or whatever. There's a moment where this was good enough for now is no longer good enough. And I think getting good at recognizing those moments is important because you might be, as a PM, to bring it back to what we were talking about, you might end up spending a lot of time on something that's not super valuable because you're not the one who's best positioned to do the work and you're used to doing it all yourself. And so there might be an analysis and you're like, oh, well, like I'll go do that myself. And you're spinning your wheels, digging around, using SQL very inefficiently when you could just go to your analytics team and like ask them a question.
Yeah. I was going to ask that. I like when you get to that point where it's great. You're being scrappy. You're doing things that you said you wanted to do. I had ideas and you just get them done yourself. Like when you get to the point where you actually have more people at your company to kind of shoulder the burden that you don't have to do everything yourself. Mm-hmm. How do you go about like switching that mindset, right? Because at one point you're just used to like, hey, I have this idea. I know this needs to get done. So I'm just going to go do it because I know I can do it. And previously I was the best one to do it. But now you hire people that are maybe more equipped or have more time to do that as your own responsibilities grow and change over time. So how do you make that mindset and start empowering other people to do those jobs and not have the fear of pushing back? Like, hey, actually, I should be the one doing that because that's why I'm here, instead of you taking time away from like whatever else you need to do.
Yeah, it's a great question. I keep saying it's a great question, which I know is so annoying when I'm listening to a podcast. So I apologize.
I hope they're actually good.
It was a really good question, because it brings up, when I started at Drift, they brought in a woman. Her name is Molly Graham. She worked at Facebook back in the day when it was doing its super hypergrowth mode. And she gave this talk about throwing your Legos. And so she talked about it like as a startup grows, like you have your set of Legos and then we bring on new people and you have to like give your Legos away because your roles change and things change, whatever. And one of the things that really stuck with me is that she said, what doesn't work is being precious about your Legos and like, hey Cam, like this is my special Lego and like this is how you do it and like this is, it's more like what we always talked about in Drift was like chucking our Legos at each other and running away. So it was like, haha, I'm gonna toss my Lego at you and I'm gonna sprint away as fast as I can and like it's yours now, because we didn't want to be like have that weird feeling that you're talking about.
Yep.
But kidding aside, I think the thing that's been helpful to me is to always be clear about what is my job, where am I supposed to be driving impact, and what is secondary to that. So you just PM yourself, right? Like, what am I here to do? Where can I be most helpful to the business? What am I good at? And let me double down on that. And then anything else is something that I would toss in a Lego toss, but I'm going to make sure I keep the stuff that either I want to learn or I'm really good at doing. So that's sort of how I think about it personally. And then there's also, new things, new challenges. And then I think also the last thing I would say is that talking about it is important, and acknowledging that it's weird and that it's uncomfortable is important, because then you have a language to discuss it. You know, we literally write docs in our wiki that are called like XYZ Lego toss. We write all this stuff in them, and then we like have a meeting and we hand them over, we talk about it, and then we're resources for each other, but we have like a ceremony where we kind of hand over our Legos to each other.
I like that analogy.
Yeah, it's a good one.
So I think we're almost running out of time. I think to end, I want to ask one question to give out free game to all of our listeners out there who are product people. This may be a tough question to answer. What is one or a few things that you would advise to a product person earlier in the career trying to move up? You may have touched on it before when we talked about the strategy things, but what are some things to other product folks out there who are trying to move up either within a company or trying to change and take that next step outside? What would you advise them to do?
A couple of things that have worked for me in the past is always be the person who follows through and follows up. So no matter what it is, be the person who brings it up before, you know, if something's going to be late, be the person who brings it up and takes ownership. If something isn't happening the way that you wanted, bring it up, talk about why, say what you learned, and fix it. So I think just developing a reputation for being someone who gets it done and gets it done well, and who there's no surprises, is always going to serve you well no matter what role you're in. So I would definitely say that. Another thing is, like I mentioned, being proactive and instead of asking for permission, offer up whatever it is that you want to do. Something I did early in my career that I learned from a consultant I worked with. Director asked me to do an analysis, and I didn't really understand why she wanted me to do it in a specific way. And I had this other idea. And so what I did was I did the analysis that she wanted, and then I presented her a second one. And I said, I have this question, so I did it both ways. Here's how I thought about it. Let me know what you think. Rather than, you know, arguing with her about what she wanted. And I think doing things like that is a way to show that you're ready, that you're thinking about something differently and you're ready without, you know, causing friction with whoever might be above you. And then I think the last thing I would say is, specifically within product, figure out how to separate your self-worth from the work that you're doing. Because the more you can treat the work as a collective effort that can win or lose or be mediocre, the more objective you're going to be about what you need to do to improve it, and the faster you're going to be able to do that. I think if you get your self-worth and your emotions wrapped up in the thing that you're building, it's going to be really hard for you to notice that it's not the right thing. And so that's a trick that is helpful to learn early, and then you can be objective, get good feedback, and move forward faster than you might otherwise be able to.
Well, very rare advice, to hear that you just have never heard before. So I really appreciate that. Great tips. And we're so grateful to have had you on the show. Just wanted to say that, everybody listening should also check out Maggie's podcast. If you haven't already, probably if you're listening to this.
And I'll say it for you guys, like and subscribe. That helps. Can we get some reviews? 5 stars reviews on the podcast, please.
I was going to ask, are we going to get the Drift sign off, the 5 stars?
If you want the Drift sign off, you're going to name 6 stars only for this podcast.
I love it.
And we'll end it on that.